Welcome, everybody, to the Cleveland State University Psychology Club podcast, Pandemic Edition. Today is our first installment of some Zoom recorded podcasts with a number of guests that we'll have in the future. Zion, I hope that you are as excited as I am for this conversation with Dr. Benninger and health psychology.
Oh, I'm beyond excited because, like you said, since we've been COVID days, there hasn't been that much like social interaction. So I'm excited to get back on track with the podcast, even though it's through Zoom. Either way, I'm excited. I'm ready, and I think it's going to be a good one.
Agreed. I'm so excited. We'll talk a lot about surf therapy and her work with that, which is just wonderful to even think about in our days of just kind of being almost funneled into the idea of like CBT or and like CBT and meds for maybe your common major depressive disorder. It's so enlightening to entertain the idea of different forms of help. So I'm really excited to hear about that in her research. So I think with that being said, let's get right into the episode. Everybody, thank you for listening. This is Dr. Benninger.
I hope you enjoy.
Hi, Professor Benninger. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. We really wanted to talk a lot about so many different aspects of your work and also some things that you maybe like to talk to undergraduates about. So first and foremost, I know you from taking a health psych class with you about a year ago. And so I wanted to kind of ask you, what is health psychology? How would you define it in like a couple sentences or something like that? And then maybe how does it relate to other aspects of the field and other things like on a broader scale, like clinical psychology or things of that nature?
Sure. So health psychology really looks at the psychological aspects of health and health behaviors. So it's related to other psychology courses because psychology in general is the study of the mind and human behavior. But this sort of narrows in looking at behavior that's more specific to health. So it looks at health behaviors sort of in more of the individual level, at the community level, and then also in a clinical setting, so such as hospitals. So why certain people seek treatment and others don't seek treatment. Why do people wait till they're severely ill in the ER to get help while other people use preventative medicine? So that's just in a nutshell what we look at with health psychology.
Okay. So you kind of touched upon how like it's really important for the individual and like how that kind of varies per everybody's different individual story. How do you feel about the role of an individual within their community and how their community plays such a big role in their overall health?
Sure. So in health psychology, we apply this model called the biopsychosocial model. So traditionally, when most people think about health, they think in terms of a medical model, which is when what physicians often use when it comes to like treating and preventing, mostly treating disease and illness. But in health psychology, we look at biological influences. So those are common that you think about in a medical model, like what causes us to get sick from like the germs that are spreading to like the food that we're eating. But then we also look at psychological aspects, so like our brain processes that influence behavior, and then the social aspects. So this kind of ties into your question about community. So not only do we understand that, for example, eating healthy is going to affect your health, but we try and understand what psychological mechanisms cause people to eat healthy or choose a healthy option. But then from the community perspective, what's even available in the first place within the community that can support those healthier options. So if you live in a neighborhood that has fast food at every corner and corner stores that mostly sell chips and high preservative food, it's less likely that you're going to be able to make that healthy choice when it comes to your eating habits. Also, income comes into play as well. So that's also has to do with the community or the social aspects. If people don't have the income to purchase healthy foods, and healthy foods tend to be much more expensive than the cheap foods we can get at fast food restaurants, then that's also going to influence people's ability to eat healthy and their health outcomes.
It's actually really interesting. I would imagine like how you brought up like the income and like what's available. I can imagine like that can really have a greater effect on the statistics that we don't even think about. So that's really interesting, actually.
Right, exactly. And sometimes when physicians, and this isn't all physicians, but typically if people go to a doctor's appointment because they are experiencing diabetes, the physician often works with them on the treatment of diabetes, but not really on shifting things in the environment that's sort of um, holding them back from making healthier lifestyle choices. So with health psychology, and if you worked as a health psychologist, you would really be looking more holistically at health, not just, okay, how do we intervene with this illness, but also how, like at the individual level, but how can we create healthier communities and healthier neighborhoods that can support health on a more population level.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes so much sense. I feel like there's kind of been at least in my work in studying clinical psychology and interest in going into counseling psychology, you definitely, um, I've just been kind of seeing like a movement towards seeing things in a more holistic view, like health psychologists do, like that biopsychosocial model, as opposed to just seeing somebody with a like the lack of a neurotransmitter being produced, or like um, being kind of socialized to negative coping mechanisms. You see those things, but it's really important. I think that something that a lot of individuals just in their lives can learn from health psychology is just to look at things from so many different mediums. So it's very interesting to hear about, and kind of touching on the communities um, and the individuals' kind of influence on the community, and vice versa. I wanted to hear about um, how, if not to be cynical, but how, or if in any way, could individuals within a community stay kind of connected during this pandemic? Is there anything that these communities can do? Not necessarily asking you to solve this enormous problem on your own, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are on how communities can stay connected during these times.
Yeah, it's a very challenging question that I think we've all been faced with the past 6 months or so with the pandemic. And I think of the last big pandemic, I think that happened in the United States was like in the 1920s, and I might be getting the dates wrong because I'm not very good at history. But they didn't have the technology that we have then. I know my grandma was alive and she was talking about it a little bit. I mean, it was so much harder for them to stay connected because people were isolating physically. And at least now, I think the fact that we can continue with school, even if it has to be virtually, which is not ideal, that's been made a huge difference because people have really stayed connected through things like Zoom. Young people are very into social media, and social media is pretty widespread now. So apps like TikTok, I know, like have kept like younger people. I mean, I work a lot with children and youth, so really kept them connected with their friends. But I think it's also been very apparent the divides that we have in our country and in our city, that people with technology and resources have done pretty okay during this time, but there's also a lot of families that don't have Wi-Fi and don't have data on their phones and good cell phone services, and those families have really struggled much more to stay connected, and those kids as well. There's a lot of kids that don't have phones, and if they do, they can't afford the data that they need to join a Zoom call and things like that. So that's definitely made it very challenging. And so there's a huge like socioeconomic divide in our city with who's doing well and staying connected and who is really limited in how they can do that. But some things that I've heard from different community partners. I'm working with an organization that's in the Clark Fulton neighborhood, which is largely Hispanic Latino neighborhood. And they've been doing open mic nights with youth every week. And the director of that organization said that they've had just an excellent turnout, like a better turnout than they've had before. And they have youth who've moved to other cities joining, and they're able to bring in speakers. So, I mean, that's an example of something she didn't really think would work that worked. That's been working well in that neighborhood. And another thing that we've tried in my neighborhood is doing some like happy hours on our front porches. So I'm in a neighborhood that a lot of people have front porches. So we've like organized certain times where everybody comes on their front porch, and we like set up tables. So it felt like almost like going to a restaurant. And this was earlier on in the pandemic, and just like ate and kind of had to yell to each other, but we still felt more connected because we were like hanging out, but at a safe distance. So you just have to be creative. There's ways to do it, but it's definitely very challenging, and it really depends. A lot of it depends on your resources too.
It makes a lot of sense. That happy hour thing sounds really fun. And like, I feel like what you were saying, like how you just have to get creative. I feel like that's a big factor that people don't tend to like think about, because you know, we're so like dependent on things being established already, and like when it comes to like things to do with other people. But I feel like just like you said, a little creativity goes a long way. I really like that.
It's very inspiring to kind of hear about the stories that people have come up with. Like, I love the open mic nights and the front porch happy hour. It's like necessity really does breed creativity, and it's nice to kind of look back and think, well, like we were at least innovative at the very least when we
Right.
needed to be.
Yeah, even in Lincoln Park, which isn't too far from me, I saw there used to be this group of like seniors who would meet for coffee every day outside of this cafe. And I started seeing them doing it in the park, and the coffee you could still do takeout, and they would spread out, you know, all their chairs were 6 feet apart in a big circle. They brought their own chairs, and they kept meeting up, you know, and so it was like a safer way to do it. And at least the weather has been nice. So, I mean, I thought that was like super cute, but also like very creative way to stay connected and stay safe at the same time.
For sure. And I'm glad to see like people are finding a way to, you know, adapt like with their regular day-to-day life with, you know, the pandemic and everything. It's just like Zach said, it's inspiring to see people are actually finding ways to like live on as they, you know, were before. So.
Mhm.
It's very, very inspiring, and it's nice to just hear some good news like that. And yeah, so I guess kind of stepping aside from the community-based conversation of when it comes to health psychology, I kind of wanted to touch upon a little bit of your research in particular. And so a big part of psychology, especially at Cleveland State, with such a heavy influence on research and empirical data. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your research with the children and youth in Cleveland and what they perceive to have the strongest influence on their health.
Sure. So I am the principal investigator on a research study that it's a qualitative study, and it's considered participatory action research. So that means that it's research where community members, which in this case are children and youth, are involved in all stages of the research process, from thinking through some of the questions to collecting data, analyzing data, and then like disseminating it and getting it out there to the right people who can actually maybe take some action on it. So the study is really focusing on trying to understand how the neighborhood influences health and well-being, and also broader topics such as like identity and self-concept, and what children and youth think are what their strategies would be for improving their health and well-being. And so it looks at not just negative aspects of the neighborhood, but also what sort of supports health and what makes it difficult to be healthy. And when we talk about health, we're looking at both physical and psychological health. And so what's really come out of the study so far is the central focus on safety, which is not something that typically when you think of health, a lot of people don't connect it with safety. But for young people, a focus on safety is the number one thing that they would prioritize because they feel like it affects their health in so many ways. So You need to feel safe to be able to go for a walk in your environment or to be able to walk to the rec center. Or if you go to the rec center, you need to feel safe when you're there, that you're not going to get bullied or beat up, or are you going to be able to walk home safely? Or do you feel safe going to the store to get the food that you need? And then also from a psychological perspective, there's been a lot of research out there looking at adverse childhood experiences and trauma. So having these experiences of violence can really affect not only somebody's psychological health, but your psychological health has an impact on your physical health too. So if you're highly anxious all the time, that can impact your immune system and it can make you sick more easily. It can also affect your sense of self. So if you're experiencing a lot of violence or abuse, then you can internalize that as like a sense of self that's not worthy of being kept safe or that's inadequate. So that can lead to other psychological disorders or challenges as well. So yeah, that's been a really big thing that's come out of this research so far, is that children need to be kept safe and they need to feel safe, children and teenagers. I've worked with, the age group is 8 through 18. Then on top of that, they've spoken a lot about just like positive social networks and social support. So whether it's coming from parents or a mentor, they spoke about, for example, like the teenage boys being able to go to the rec center and lift weights with like this other community member who's like in his late 20s, who talks to them about life and helps them feel supported when maybe they don't feel as comfortable talking to their parents about it. Also just opportunities to experience new things, that can really affect more generally, I guess, their well-being. I'm thinking about it that way, like being able to get out of the neighborhood and see new things and go onto Cleveland State's campus and learn about college, or go to a museum at downtown or things like that. So those are some of the main lessons that I've learned so far in the project. It is still ongoing for another year, so I'm sure there's a lot more to learn as well.
Yeah, I can't imagine how much more information has yet to be discovered so
Right.
far. And one thing that you kind of touched upon was the relationship between so many aspects of health, and that being like the physical safety, feeling like you can walk to like the rec center, as you mentioned, or having like an anxiety about it, and how that like that relationship is symbiotic. And something that comes up for me when you kind of mentioned chronic stress was, forgive me if I get his title incorrect, but I believe he's a neurobiologist, Robert Sapolsky, who's done a lot of research in that field. And I remember watching a series of lectures from him, and just hearing him give an analogy of how so many animals have the tendency to create their stress response and have the sympathetic nervous system kick in, and then once the perceived threat has faded away, they can kick in the parasympathetic nervous system and start to relax, where that chronic stress doesn't really seem to work in this day and age for human beings, and it just kind of stays up. So yeah, that just kind of came to mind, and to think about how that could be happening in our communities, in particular for people who are trying to find access to those things that can promote healthy behaviors.
Yeah,
So yeah.
exactly. And sometimes it's not functional to kind of to switch off that fight or flight switch, when it's on. If you're experiencing sort of ongoing threats in your environment, you're not going to switch it off because you need it on to survive. But then that's taking away from your other body functions, such as like the functions that help you not get sick. So then people who experience chronic stress end up being more likely to get sick and to also have more chronic illnesses as well. So there is this direct connection with stress and your psychological well-being and your physical health.
So kind of on that note about the idea of children building their sense of selves and how that kind of relates to the community, I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit about your experience with children constructing their sense of self, and kind of how that incorporates into their communities. How does their making their identity, how can you make that process easier for them to kind of construct that sense of self? I was just kind of wondering your thoughts on that.
Sure. So the research that I did on self-concept took place in Cape Town, South Africa, where I used to live and completed my PhD. And so was really built on this idea that a lot of interventions aimed at improving children's psychological health and well-being had this focus on self-concept, but I felt like looking at the literature and the research out there that we really didn't know enough about how a healthy sense of self is really developed, and how things outside of the individual affect that. So I think self-concept or self-esteem interventions often target like the individual, but actually it's more of like a collective effort, and it's impacted by the larger like neighborhood and community environment and social environment. The research I did with children in Cape Town, it was another participatory study, and really aiming to explore how children construct a sense of self in an environment where they're experiencing high levels of oppression related to a racist history of apartheid, which happened in South Africa, and poverty and community violence, and how these things were having an impact on their sense of self. And so very similar to what I found when looking at health and well-being in Cleveland is that the kids, every conversation circled back to safety. And so in order to support a healthy sense of self or healthy self-concept, the kids said that children need to be kept safe first. So any policies or programs that want to improve self-esteem or help support a healthy self-concept need to first make sure children are safe. And it's very difficult for children to feel good about themselves if that essential need isn't met. And then once children are made to feel safe, the kids said that opportunities to experience new and exciting things was also really important. So for example, some of the kids were connected to a surfing program. So they talked a lot about learning this challenging skill and mastering it really made them feel very confident in themselves and feel very good about themselves, even if we knew that many of the kids were still experiencing abuse in the home environment or witnessing violence in the community, that having this opportunity to learn these new skills still help them sort of preserve the integrity of the self, even when faced with adversity in the environment. And then the other big thing was social connectedness. So having that ongoing support, whether it was from parents or from families or from a mentor or a coach even, that was encouraging, and that just somebody who listened to you and made you feel like you mattered and that you were important, even if you were maybe experiencing violence elsewhere, really helped once again to kind of preserve like that healthy sense of self, even if other environments were kind of telling you that you're not worth it. The fact that you had this like consistent person in your life, or even friends to support you, really helped make that made it easier to not think negatively about yourself. And so I think there's a lot of implications for interventions and programs that aim at like improving self-esteem or building self-esteem, that it's not really going to happen in a once-off workshop where you're doing a collage about, feeling good about yourself, that it's just this ongoing community-wide effort really to make sure kids continue to be as safe as possible, but also supported and have opportunities to experience and develop new and exciting skills, even if they're in neighborhoods where those resources aren't readily available.
I find it incredibly disappointing that you can't just solve a problem like that, especially when it comes to community building or self-esteem building. And it makes so much sense that things definitely need to be taken in a kind of a long-term processing and thinking about long-term solutions for long-term problems, such as building self-esteem and building those communities. And you sort of touched upon it just now, but I wanted to hear a little bit about some of the implications that you've seen from the children's work in constructing themselves. Like you said, having that one link, whether it be a family member or a friend or just that activity, like you mentioned, the surf therapy, like I was wondering what the implications of those things are and how those build the self and what that implication is, and how that kind of impacts themselves as well as their communities.
Right. So, I mean, I think there's things that we need to tackle sort of like as organizations operating in neighborhoods or working with young people, and also like on a policy level too. Like, first of all, we need to make sure our neighborhoods are safer, and we need to look at some of those root causes of why our neighborhoods aren't safe. And often that's connected, I know, in the context of Cape Town and also very much so in Cleveland. Safety is very much connected to inequality, racial segregation, histories of racism that are current too, where certain systems just perpetuate it, and poverty. So if we're not really tackling some of these things that are the root around racism and poverty that affects our neighborhoods, then we're not really going to support, at least on like a larger scale, like the self-esteem and the self-concept of children. And then if they grow up feeling pretty bad about themselves, then they're a lot less likely to engage in more pro-social behaviors or to be successful in life or to achieve their goals. And I'm not saying that they can't, because a lot of kids are very resilient and they still will, but they have to work a whole lot harder on it. So we have to really target those root causes, which is not easy. It's not as easy as developing a workshop to promote self-esteem. But we also have to do things on the individual level. So like, I think like formal mentoring programs and things like that really can help individuals. So it's not discounting those small little efforts. They're small wins, and they all make a difference. And if they make a difference in the lives of a couple of kids, that also really matters too. So we have to look at how can we kind of at a neighborhood level support kids to have opportunities to learn new skills and to be supported, whether it's supporting parents to learn how to talk to their kids, or developing mentoring programs, or honestly teaching basketball coaches how to not only coach, but how to be there to like socially support young people. And that kind of needs to be more ongoing, not just once off. And then just, yeah, making sure there's resources to provide opportunities, especially in areas where opportunities are a lot more limited.
Do you feel like it's a little harder to kind of introduce those self-esteem building activities and discussions into, like you said, neighborhoods that maybe experience higher rates of domestic abuse, or anything, or like higher crime rates? Do you feel like maybe the socialization of that being kind of the norm makes it difficult to implement those thought process and those activities?
Yes, and one example in South Africa, and this is actually something else I learned about kind of self-concept there, is that it's very fluid. So people can kind of have this identity in one environment, and it can shift very easily when you're in another. So, I mean, I have the way I carry myself when I'm in a classroom, and that maybe is going to be very different than if I'm having happy hour with a friend on a Friday night. And it's the same for kids too. So in Cape Town, I had some kids in a surf therapy program that I was running, and we connected like psychoeducational activities to the sport of surfing. So trying to make it fun, but we teach them like coping skills and talking about their emotions and how to manage anger and stuff like that. So things that all were like interrelated to self-esteem, as well as like other positive psychological functioning. And we saw very clear behavior changes at the kids when they were at the program, because there was this culture of being able to talk about your emotions very openly and being respected and being supported. But they talked about how when they go into their normal like neighborhood environment, they switch that off very fast, because they said it's not very functional, especially like thinking of like a 14-year-old boy in an environment where there's a lot of gang violence and gang activity. It's not very functional to show you're like an emotional person in that setting, because it's not, you can't keep yourself safe. You have to look hard, you have to act hard, because that's how they protect themselves. So it totally made sense when they explained it like that. But I felt like at first the program was a failure, because I'm like, well, how come you act like this here? But then I'm hearing from like your teacher that you got in a fight with somebody on the way home from school. And it's like, well, because here I can, but I can't do that out there. Um, so yeah, it's challenging. And it also makes sense. Like if you're not in an environment where it's safe to act in a certain way, it's natural to try and protect yourself. And that might mean acting hard and not being able to connect with your emotions and things like that if it's not socially accepted.
That makes a lot of sense. And like, it's really interesting because I feel like that's something that people don't really think about in regards to like why people act the way they do, and especially like in public, or like, because I know it's like some people, like if they've had a lot of trauma or just bad situations in life, they tend to become more cynical, but like behind the scenes, they're very emotional, and like they're very kind to people. And you can, yeah, from what they said, like from what you said, like you asked that person, well, why do you act so different here, and then you get into a fight. It's just like the different scenarios. It's also almost kind of like a defense mechanism that they kind of put up, and I feel like that's something that people just don't really consider. Like, I guess it just comes down to circumstance and the individual. So
Yeah, definitely. It's like a defense mechanism or a protective mechanism, what you have to do to kind of survive in the different environments. So you can't, you can target things on the individual level, but I think for like effective behavior change, there needs to be a shift in the environment too. So you have to try and shift the environment and make it safer, or make it so like the general culture of the neighborhood is more accepting of the change that you're trying to implement in a program. And that's obviously very, very challenging.
Something that I know we've been very, very excited to ask you about is your work in surf therapy, particularly in Cape Town, South Africa. Um, so I'd love to hear about your work with it. If you had to like maybe give it a definition or just kind of describe the work that you've done with surf therapy, and then maybe some of the long-lasting effects that you've seen in its participants, maybe for their self-esteem building or building themselves, and like how that relates to their communities as well.
Sure. So surf therapy is a fairly new growing sector, related to, kind of grounded in the fields of both psychotherapy, so from the psychology perspective, but as I've connected more and more with other people trying to implement similar programs, is also very much connected to occupational therapy and physical therapy too. So when I was in South Africa, I didn't know of anybody else doing surf therapy, but I was working with kids who were having some very challenging behavior problems in school. And so I started meeting with them after school and trying to do what I call like psychoeducation. So not therapy or treatment, but just like, can I do fun activities that draw these kids to stay after school, but also teach them like how to cope better with what's going on in life. And we started taking walks to a beach that was about a mile from their school. And these were children classified as Black and colored in South Africa. So they were, as of 1994, not allowed to go to beaches, especially beaches that were labeled as white beaches. And so many of these kids, even though this was only like, this is probably 6 years ago or 7, I'm losing track of time, because their families historically weren't allowed at beaches, their families never had the opportunity to learn how to swim, or never had the culture around going to these beaches. And so they were going to the beach for the very first time, even though they lived about a mile away from it. And when we were there, we started going every weekend, and we would play soccer because that was what they're really interested in. And we would learn some like life skills. And a surf shop that was located at the beach started recognizing that we were there, and they offered us free surf lessons for the kids. So I asked the kids what they thought, and they were like, well, Black kids can't really surf. First of all, it was like, what, they thought it was like a sport for white people, because it's largely a sport connected to white privilege and resources. And I was like, well, that's not really true. You just never had the opportunity. And I, at the time, couldn't surf either. So I'm like, well, what if we try and learn together? So they agreed that they'd surf if we all learned together. And so when we started doing these surf lessons, I just noticed something shift in these kids when they were out in the water, that they were like suddenly focused, they were calm, they were smiling, which I had like so rarely seen. They were just like allowed to be, they were like kids, which normally they weren't acting like typical children. They were very like hard, and they were just being kids, but they were also calm. So I started to sort of get more curious about it, and I was studying clinical psychology. So I started applying the theories that I was learning from a clinical perspective around mindfulness and that connection with the ocean, and how that improves, how that can be very therapeutic. And then also with cognitive behavioral theory and humanistic theory about like the relationship building. And so I use those theories to develop a model for a program that was aimed at sort of using surfing as a tool for mental health promotion, basically. And so we decided to call it surf therapy. I really felt like it was actually more on health promotion, because I never wanted it to be treatment for the kids. And I received a grant for it. And so I recruited youth from the neighborhoods who with the assistance of trained surf coaches, taught how to surf and trained on how to deliver sort of psychosocial lessons with the kids. And so it would be more of like a community-centered, community-run program. But I also wanted the support that the kids would get to be more like culturally relevant, but also more sustainable. I wanted the support to come more from the community youth than from me. And so the program kind of grew, and it expanded to a few other neighborhoods, and it had a really positive impact on the kids, and on, hopefully the goal is on the communities as well, where more and more people were learning these skills, where they didn't have to be dependent on clinical psychologists or psychiatrists, who you can't find very many of in South Africa anyway, to come and treat these kids, that they could feel confident in understanding mental health and in doing things that could help promote the mental health and help these kids cope. And, you know, if they could possibly refer, also understand on how to refer kids to more psychological treatment if they needed it. But quite honestly, there was nowhere to refer to most of the time. So that's how that started. And now, since I've moved back to the United States 3 years ago, organization formed. It's called the International Surf Therapy Organization. And we've had 3 conferences so far. And through this, we kind of found out that surf therapy was happening around the world in very unique ways. And it was similar, like people just kind of trying this out, whether it was an occupational therapist who was a surfer who started doing occupational therapy in the water with kids with autism, which was happening in LA, to someone in Portugal who was doing like physical therapy and connecting it into the water. There's a group in San Diego that works with active military service duty members who have experienced physical and psychological trauma, doing both physical and psychotherapy and connecting it to surfing. So it's a growing network, but we're finding there's like different focuses. So there's like sort of the physical occupational surf therapy, and then there's more of like the surf therapy used for mental health promotion, with especially with young people experiencing behavioral difficulties or exposed to like adverse childhood experiences. So it's kind of exciting, and I'm excited to see where this sector kind of goes, and I'm happy to be a part of its development.
I think the overall versatility of it just is so appealing. I think, and it's incredible to think about, like you said, how it's going on everywhere, and how it's just kind of starting to get picked up. I'm curious to see, or I guess I'm just curious to know, the amount of people that maybe just picked up surfing because they thought it looked cool, or they're like, hey, I need a way to exercise and I'm near a body of water, and maybe they're incidentally becoming a participant in their own version of surf therapy. Um,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I feel like that's kind of what happened to me. Like I accidentally became a surfer, and I had a history of, I had post-traumatic stress in the past, due to from being assaulted. And while I was going to therapy, which I think was very helpful, I was seeing a therapist, but it was like the ocean was what was working. And it's not to downplay that impact that therapy was having, but I felt like therapy was helping me kind of cope in the world of all these expectations. Like, okay, I was a student at the time. I have to go to school. I'm studying this clinical psychology. I have to show up for my classes, whether I'm feeling like shit or not. But the surfing was helping me heal, and it was helping me reconnect with my body in a way that you lose when you experience a trauma, because of that flight response, or fight, flight, and freeze response. You disconnect from your body, and it's so hard to reconnect. And surfing really helps you reconnect, and it helps you heal. And so I think people heal on their own through surfing, or they heal through these programs that really couple surfing with more traditional psychotherapy, or with social support and mentorship, or with coping skills. So it's really cool, like you said, the uh, diversity in the sector of surf therapy, and it's really exciting, all these positive impacts. I had no idea that that it would have such an impact on children with autism. I didn't, because of the sensory experience in the water. I'm not really trained. I don't around that. I don't typically work with children with disabilities. That's not my background. But there's these occupational therapists bringing children with autism to the ocean, and they're showing some very positive outcomes in their development and in their well-being. And that's so cool. I would have never thought that, but it's just a creative way to do therapy, or to even promote health. And I think we have to keep doing more things like this, because I think traditional sort of psychotherapy or clinical models don't work for everybody. Like sitting and talking to somebody about what's going on with you is really effective for certain people, but it's not reaching others.
Yeah. I
I
think,
completely agree.
go ahead, Zion. I'm sorry.
No, I was just saying I completely agree, and it's great that the surfing did help not only kids and everything, but I'm glad that it actually brought forth a positive effect for you too. And I think it's one of the most beautiful things in the world when you're trying to do something that's good for others, but it also brings out happiness and joy and goodness for you too. So it's really inspiring to hear that.
Thanks.
One thing I kind of wanted to note on is you kind of mentioned how some versions of therapies don't necessarily work for everybody. And I think we're definitely seeing that in the term, in the frame of psychiatry and prescription drugs when it comes to mental illnesses, and how you have people that maybe just, they try out, for example, like Prozac, and just first time hits a try and it's like perfect for them. And then you have other people that are trying so many different antidepressants. And I understand I'm kind of hitting um, just SSRIs, for example, but yeah, some therapies that may work for others don't work for anybody else, maybe. And I think maybe seeing a push in subjectivity over objectivity in the realm of health from a biopsychosocial model would be really beneficial for, I guess, individuals that are seeking to improve their well-being. And one thing that I heard you kind of mention when you said, like, both in when you were introducing surf therapy and then in your own experiences with it, was just that idea of like the children being themselves again, or just feeling so connected and mindful of, for example, the water, or of your bodily movements. Um, excuse me. That sort of brings me to a project I came across a while ago by and I'll plead ignorance if I mispronounce his name. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi wrote a project about flow psychology in the 90s, and he kind of touched upon the idea of when you're in a state of flow, when you just lose track of time and you almost don't even think, you're just so enveloped in what you're doing. Um, you kind of touched upon the idea of activities that provide flow. Like, for example, maybe you're hiking and you're just so connected to the way that your feet are connecting to the ground, or how the wind's kind of blowing in your face, rock climbing, or I guess anything can be a flow activity. I'm curious if that idea of flow that I'm kind of introducing right now, if that kind of resonates with you when you were experiencing that therapy, and if maybe you saw the children when they were being enveloped in the therapy, that in the action of surfing. Maybe did you see that they were just kind of so conscious and so mindful, as opposed to when they were just kind of, maybe in school, or when you were doing that psychoeducation with them outside of school?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very much the same thing. Sometimes we label it different things, but this concept of flow that I don't know too much about, but it sounds like that's exactly kind of what was happening. I know, I'm trying to think of the Gestalt therapist who said this, but he said that anxiety is the space between the future and the now. And so when you're in the now, you don't experience that anxiety, and anxiety is largely connected to what you're experiencing. If you've had like trauma in the past and things like that, you're kind of living with in this state of anxiety. But when you're in the moment, you don't feel it. You're okay. You're actually almost always okay in the moment. um, and so I think, yeah, surfing, you can't lose the moment, because you're like, the ocean forces you into it no matter what, especially when it comes to like the waves. So I think it's a little unique in that sense of like, if your mind kind of starts to wander, then you get like knocked off the board with the wave, because you're paddling, you're reading, you're learning to read the ocean, you're trying to move with the waves or around the waves or duck under the waves, and so that's pretty cool with surfing. But I do think a lot of other activities can create a very similar experience, like hiking or just being in nature, or yoga, rock climbing. Rock climbing probably requires a more intense focus. So that probably, I could see how that could be a similar experience too. So it'd be really interesting to see if there's programs kind of making these connections, and to try, like from a research perspective, to measure those things, how they're affecting people.
I suppose, kind of shifting gears from surf therapy, if there isn't anything else that you would like to add about your work in it, or any thoughts that you may have about surf therapy that you wanted to mention.
I think that the only thing is I've been really trying to think of how I could apply similar principles in Cleveland, where I am now, and this is my hometown where I grew up. So I like paddleboarding and stuff like that, and hiking, and so trying to recognize the potential for developing programs that could have a similar impact on kids, where we don't have the ocean. You can surf in Lake Erie sometimes, but the conditions aren't usually that great. So yeah, I just think there's a potential for that, for anybody interested in kind of in psychology or in this kind of work, that there's a lot of potential to develop new creative therapeutic programming out there.
Okay, so I was on that note, I was kind of curious to shift gears into discussing how maybe your traditional undergraduate college student, or anybody seeking for a higher education within health psychology, um, how could somebody in that position maybe learn more, or put themselves on a path best suited to become a health psychologist?
Sure. So in psychology, there's kind of two main tracks, and they're both related to health psychology. You can be on more of a research track, which can also relate to like practice, like applications. So if you were to go on to a master's program, it could be related to research, but you could focus on health psychology and health psychology applications, like in a community setting, for example. You could focus on that. And you would learn skills through that master's program related to research, as well as like kind of the theoretical um, underpinnings of health psychology. Community psychology is very interconnected with health psychology. So if you can't find like a master's program that's specific to health psychology, community psychology programs really do apply almost the same concepts and theories and things like that as health psychology. It's really focused on health promotion and promoting mental health more so than treatment. And then there's the clinical side. So that's for people really interested in therapy aspects. So if you go and do a master's in something like clinical psychology, and you can become like a marriage and family therapist or a psychotherapist, and you can focus in a hospital setting. So from there, if you really enter any clinical program, it's your internship that kind of helps you specialize in health psychology or not. You may be able to take health psychology courses, but you would want to select to have an internship in like more of a community-based setting or in a hospital setting, working with patients in that setting. And then for those of you who want to take it even further, there's also PhD programs in both. Typically a PhD is in research. So if you want to do more research, which was my route, and intervention development, you would probably seek a PhD in health psychology or community psychology or research psychology and focus on those topics. Or you could do a PsyD, which is typically the clinical doctorate program where you would focus much more heavily on psychotherapy and treatment, but you could still apply it in more like a community-based settings too. So really either track, you have to decide what's best for you. If you go the clinical track, you have to get licensed, and typically the type of job you would have would be more around treatment. If you go sort of the research track, you probably end up working more with on the health promotion and prevention side of things.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much for that. I wanted to kind of close off our recording today and our time together by asking you kind of a two-part question that we love to ask all of our guests. And that's one, what has been like the passion or the motivation that's kept you in this field, and the thing that's kept you coming back? And also, what's some advice that you may or may not have for some undergraduate students that, whether maybe it be specifically to get a PhD in community psych, like you were saying, or just any interest in health psychology at all? Do you have any advice for undergraduates as they kind of make their way through their education and pursue what they want to do occupationally in the future?
Sure, and I kind of forgot to mention that in the previous question, but it's very possible for, for undergraduates, volunteering, I think, is really important. So getting out in the community and volunteering, whether it's at a clinic or at a rec center, a community center, there's always volunteer opportunities. I know for me as an undergraduate, I volunteered in a hospital setting with child life specialists, and that kind of really sparked my interest in health psychology and psychology more generally. So I got to work more on the psychological needs of kids who were hospitalized long term. And that really changed my trajectory and gave me a lot of experience. I also worked for Boys and Girls Club in college. So working for youth programs, youth organizations, depending on, my focus has always largely been on young people. Volunteering is really helpful. I know your time is limited, but it does get you exposed to different fields and helps create that inspiration and a sense of direction. There's also sometimes internship and job opportunities out there too. Like, I didn't volunteer at Boys and Girls Club. I found a part-time job where I could work in this setting with youth from urban neighborhoods, while also getting paid, which helped me pay my bills. So that was also nice. For me, what always keeps me going is just showing up. And that's what I remind myself. Like, sometimes I get really frustrated, or I feel like as I spoke about earlier, there's these like deep root problems to the issues I've seen children experience, and I just don't know how to tackle those. I wish I had that cure to poverty and racism, but I just show up, and I show up in communities that I'm working with, or in my own community, or in places where I want to learn more. And sometimes showing up just means listening, especially until you really understand what's going on. So being open-minded, being inquisitive, being curious, and listening for a while. And then kind of the rest sort of unfolds. So I've never been a researcher that could just sit in a lab or at my computer and find inspiration writing manuscripts and publishing papers and analyzing data. I have to show up in the community, and I have to listen, and I have to just be present. And then the inspiration comes very easily.
Dr. Benninger, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate everything you mentioned, from your research with children and community building, and particularly the surf therapy. That was so much fun to learn about. So thank you so much for being with us today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And also, good luck with everything you do and with your continued research. Thank you again for your time.